Welcome back to your free Active Directory course. In the last video, I looked at how accounts work in Active Directory in Windows. In this video, I will look at how to create a user account in Active Directory and some of the options that can be configured. To do this, I will change to one of my domain controllers. Before I create a user account in Active Directory, I first want to create a new UPN suffix to show how these relate to user accounts. To do this, open Active Directory Domains and Trusts from the Administrative Tools under the Start menu. To access the UPNs for this forest, right-click on Active Directory Domains and Trusts at the top, not the domain, and open the properties. The domain is called ITFreeTraining.local, but since the user's email addresses will end with .com, this could confuse the user when they log in. To fix this, I will add a new UPN suffix called ITFreeTraining.com. Now when I create a new user, I will have the option to have their login end in .com rather than .local. I will now exit out and open Active Directory Users and Computers from the Start menu. Later in the course, I will look at how to organize users and computers better in Active Directory, but for the present, I will open Users, which has all the users for this domain. To create a new user, right-click Users and select New User to launch the New User wizard. To create the user, enter the basic information like the first and last name. For the login name, I will use the last name and first initial. Notice that since I have added the additional UPN suffix, I now have a choice of which UPN suffix to use. It is important to note that if you log in using a UPN suffix, you need to have access to the global catalog server. This is because the user UPN suffix combination must be unique for the forest. To understand why this is the case, consider two different domains in the same forest. The user John Doe is moved to high-cost training, but wants to keep his login ending in ITFreeTraining.com. The user is moved and the UPN suffix is left as ITFreeTraining.com, even though the user account John Doe is now in the high-cost training domain. Now imagine another person called John Doe joins the company. There is nothing stopping a new user account called Doe J being created in the ITFreeTraining domain because the original Doe J account has been moved. The problem occurs if the new John Doe's UPN suffix is attempted to be set to ITFreeTraining.com. This will not be allowed because essentially the two users would have the same username UPN combination. To prevent this happening and also work out which domain a user belongs to, when a user login uses a UPN suffix, you need a global catalog server because a global catalog server can answer queries like these on a forest level. Below this, you have the option to configure a pre-Windows 2000 name. In most cases, it is simplest to leave this the name as the user logon named above. This will generally only be a problem if the username is over 20 characters. On the next screen, you need to enter in a password for the new user. By default, the option below this, User must change password at next logon, will be ticked. When the user attempts to log on to the network for the first time, they will be asked to change their password. This provides additional security as it means the administrator will not know the password. If this was not set and the user did not change their password, the user could accuse the administrator of accessing their account since they set the password originally and thus know what the password is. The next option prevents the user from changing the password. Usually this option will be enabled when creating a shared account. For example, an account that may be used to access an internet kiosk used by many users. You don't want one user changing the password and preventing other users from using the kiosk later on. Also, this option is sometimes used for a service account or for an account used to run a particular application. If the password for this account was to change, especially if the account was used on multiple computers, this would prevent the application or service from running. The next option, Password Never Expires, means the account will be exempted from the domain password policy requiring the password to be changed after a certain amount of time. This tick box is normally ticked when creating service accounts. Service accounts are often created to run applications like Exchange. If the password for the service account were to expire and it was being used to run software such as Exchange, all the Exchange servers using the account would stop running and no one would be able to access their email. You can see why this option is often ticked for service accounts. The last option disables the account. Once the account is created, you can disable the account at any time, but you may want to create a new user account that is in a disabled state for many different reasons. Until the account is enabled, no one will be able to use the account. For this reason, it is perfect for a template user account. As I will demonstrate later on, any account can be copied to provide the default settings for a new account. Some administrators will create a special template account that they simply copy each time they want to create a new user. Since this account will only be used for creating new users and will never be used to access the network, it can be disabled. Once I press Next, I will be taken to the last screen of the wizard. Once I press Finish, the new user will be created. Once the user account is created, you will most probably want to configure more options for the user. To do this, right-click the user account and select Properties. On the General tab, you can configure some information about the user account to help identify the account. For example, you could add a description to the account and the office the account is in. If the account is a service account, I would recommend setting a description so another administrator knows exactly what the service account is being used for. Having a description like this lets another administrator know what effect changing properties in the account may have. If I select the Address tab, you can configure additional information about the user. These options do not affect how the user account operates. They simply provide more information about the user to a person looking at the user account. A user on the network could, for example, run a query on the network showing all the users in a particular city using these files if they were configured. On the Account tab, there are quite a few options, and in most cases, an IT administrator will be mostly using the settings on this tab for day-to-day administration. At the top is the user logon name. This can be changed at any time. For example, if the user were to change their name, their login may also need to change. Notice to the right of this, the UPN for the account can also be changed at any time. Below this is the pre-Windows 2000 name. On most networks, you will not need to worry about configuring this unless you have some really old clients accessing the network. The option below this allows you to configure the logon hours the account can be used. If I press Logon Hours for that user, you can configure which hours the user can log on to the network. For example, you may want to configure these for business hours. By default, if the user is logged in outside these hours, they will still be able to access any network connections they currently have open. However, any new network connections cannot be created. If you wish, you can change this using group policy to force disconnection of the user's connections outside these hours. If I exit out of here, I can also configure which computers the user can use, selecting the option Logon To. Here you can enter in all the computers they will be able to use. In a secure environment, you may want to configure this option to ensure the user only uses certain computers. If I now go back to the properties for the user, the next tick box down, Unlock Account, determines if the user account is locked. If a user has too many wrong password attempts, the account will automatically be locked. Until the account is unlocked, the user will not be able to log on to the network. If they are already logged on, they will not be able to make any new connections. Depending on the configuration of your network, the account may unlock itself after a certain amount of time. If this does not happen, an administrator will need to come into this screen and untick the Unlock Account tick box to allow the user to use the account. Under this option are the account options. Some of them are from the New User Wizard. At the top, you have the option to force the user to change their password next time they log in. The next option will prevent the user from changing their password. When this option is ticked, an administrator will need to change the password for the user account. The next option down will configure the password for the user to never expire. This overrides whatever password expiry options that are configured in the domain. The next option down, Store Password using Reversible Encryption, stores a copy of the user password that can be decrypted. This is considered to be just as secure as storing the password in plain text. Anyone with enough access to Active Directory can read the user account attributes and decrypt the password. For this reason, it is best not to use this option unless you have a really good reason. Some older clients may require this option to work, and some migration systems may require this. For example, if you want to migrate your users from Active Directory to another directory service, you may need to enable this option in order to transfer the user password. Just remember the following. The password will not be stored until the user changes their password. Moving down to the next option, Account is disabled, we'll do that. Disable the account. If a user leaves the company, it is good practice to disable the account first rather than deleting it. A user account may have certificates and other security attached to it. Once the account is deleted, those are lost. Instead of deleting the user account, a company may simply disable the user account. When the company hires a new person, the username is changed to that new person. This process is a lot simpler than delete the user account and then attempting to configure a new user with the same access the last user had. The option below this, Smart Card is required for interactive logon, will not allow the user to log on to Active Directory unless they use a smart card to log in. This provides additional security if you have smart cards configured in your organization. The option below this, Account is sensitive and cannot be delegated, prevents delegation on the account. Delegation is when one computer accesses another computer and then asks it to connect to another computer. Let's consider an example of where you might want to disable this. Let's say you had a proxy server accessing the internet for your network. To have better security on your network, you create a user called proxy user to run the proxy software on this server. A hacker on the internet was able to discover a vulnerability on the server and was able to get control of the proxy server. Between the proxy server and the network is a firewall, so the proxy server is already limited to what it could get access to. The hacker wants to access another server on the network, but the firewall is blocking it. The hacker could use delegation in the following way. The hacker could send a command from the proxy server to a server that can be accessed from the proxy server, asking it to access another server. This server would then pass the command onto the next server. This is what delegation is. The ability to ask one computer to ask another computer to do something using your credentials. In this case, the hacker could use an internal server to access another server that was blocked by the firewall. Kind of like leapfrogging your way through the network. Delegation is disabled in Windows by default. However, if it were to be enabled, by ticking this tick box, you could be assured that this account cannot be used for delegation even if delegation was configured. The next option, use Kerberos Des Encryption types for this account, changes the encryption used to store the user password in DES. This is a weaker encryption standard, but the password is still encrypted, giving you some security. If you are using a non-Windows system, you may need to enable this in order to support Kerberos on the system. For example, some Unix systems may need this. However, before enabling this, I would see if there are any updates that can be put on the other system, so you do not need to enable this option. The next option, this account supports Kerberos Aes 128-bit encryption, means that if requested, 128-bit encryption will be used. This gives you more security, but also means that more processing power is required. The next option configures support for 256-bit encryption. The same applies, if ticked, for the 256-bit encryption. Just remember that ticking these options does not mean the higher encryption will be used. It just means that it is available and will be used when the client supports it and is configured to use it. The last option, do not require Kerberos pre-authentication, means that a timestamp for when the user was authenticated will not be added to the Kerberos ticket. Without the timestamp in the Kerberos ticket, a hacker could record communications between the client and the server and use it in what is called a replay attack. A replay attack is when the same communication is played back to the server from the hacker at a later date, pretending to be that computer. Some authentication systems may need this option enabled in order to work. Like a lot of the other options, only enable this option if you need to and understand what effect this will have on security. At the bottom of the screen is the option to configure when the account expires. By default, the account will never expire. If you configure the account to expire, the account will stop working at midnight on this date. By default, the user will not be able to make any new connections after midnight, but you can also configure Windows to disconnect any connections they have open. You would normally configure this option when you have people working for the company for a limited amount of time. If they were to have their employment extended, you could simply change the date the account expires. This covers all the settings on the Account tab. If I select the Profile tab, I can determine where Windows will store the profile for this user. If no settings are configured, when a user logs on to a system for the first time, a user profile will be created on that computer for that user. If the user were to log on to multiple computers, each computer they log into will have a separate profile created for them. The profile contains the settings for the user, such as the desktop icons and printers. To give the user a more consistent experience, you may decide to keep the user profile on the network. This is referred to as a roaming profile. In order to set a roaming profile, simply enter in a location on the network that the user has access to store the profile. For the username, you may enter in %username%. Windows will substitute this user's logon name for the %username%. If you are going to copy this user account later on to create a new account, using a substitution like this will save you having to go back in afterwards and changing the settings on the new account. Under this setting, you have the option to enter in a login script. This script will be run when the user logs in. In the old days, a lot of settings, including mapping of network drives, were performed using the login script. Nowadays, a lot of settings that were originally configured using a login script are now performed using group policy, so on some networks you may not even have the need to use a login script. If you do, enter in the name of the script here and it will be run each time the user logs in. Under this, you can configure a home folder for the user. This allows you to configure a location for the user to store their documents. Here you can either enter in a location or map a drive to the location that you want to use. On the next tab, the Telephones tab, you can enter in a number of different phone numbers for the user and some other notes for the user. This is all information relating to the user and does not affect the way the user account operates. The next tab, Organization, is once again additional information about the user. Here you can enter in information about the user like their job title, department, and company. The next tab is the Member Of tab. This tab lists all the groups this user is a member of. Later in the course, I will cover groups in a lot more detail. If you want to add a group, select the option Add and enter in the group that you want to add. Once there is a second group and I can select one of the groups, the option Set Primary Group becomes available. This configures the primary group that is associated with that user. In a Windows environment, this does not affect anything. In other operating systems like Macintosh, this has an effect on file activities. For example, in Macintosh, when you create a new file, the primary user will be set to the primary group configured here. The next tab, Remote Desktop Services Profile, is used when you want to configure a separate profile for desktop services. In previous versions of Windows, this was called Terminal Services. In Windows Server 2008, Terminal Services was renamed to Desktop Services. I won't spend too much time on this one as they are the same as the Profile tab. At the top, you can enter in a profile name, and below this you can set a home folder just like the Profile tab. The important thing to remember is that if the settings are configured on this tab, this will override the settings on the Profile tab when the user connects using Remote Desktop Services. The reason there are two groups of settings is to best suit the needs of the user. A remote desktop could be accessed from anywhere, from any computer, and thus it makes sense to always use the same profile. Regardless of which server the user connects to, they probably want the same desktop icons and settings when they connect to the remote desktop, regardless of which computer they connect from. In contrast to this, a user may log in into multiple physical computers. For example, maybe they have a special computer just for printing and CD burning, due to it having additional software on it. In this case, they may not want a roaming profile, as they want different settings and desktop configuration for each of the computers. Having two groups of settings like this gives you a lot of options. The setting "Deny this user permissions to log on to remote desktop session host server" denies access to that user to remote desktop. In Windows Server 2008, if the server is configured for remote configuration mode, this setting is not checked. Remote configuration allows two administrators to connect to the server using remote desktop for administration purposes. If the server is configured for application mode, which allows as many users as you have licenses for, and this setting is checked, even an administrator will be blocked from accessing the server via remote desktop. The next tab, Personal Virtual Desktop, lets you assign a virtual Hyper-V machine to the user. Once you tick the tick box, you can enter in the name for the virtual machine. Unfortunately, only Hyper-V is supported and only one computer can be assigned here. The next tab, COM+, allows you to configure a partition set to be used with COM+. COM+ provides an application framework for applications. If you have an application on the network that can use it, you can configure which partition set to use. The partition set simply allows the data between different users to be separated. The next tab to look at is the Dial-In tab. Except for the first option, all the other options apply to dial-up access to the network using a modem. At the top is Network Access Permissions. The first two settings allow or deny access. By default, the third option, Control Access through NPS Network Policy, will be checked. Originally, all remote access had to be configured per user by selecting the first two options, either Allow or Deny. In a large environment, this becomes very difficult to manage. Also, using this approach, management cannot be simplified by using groups. With Windows Server 2008, Microsoft added the Network Policy Server, which allows remote administration to be centralized and controlled a lot easier. The next setting allows you to configure a caller ID. This is used by dial-up to confirm that the phone number that is used to connect to the network is the phone number entered here. Under this is some options relating to callback. Callback means that the server will call the user back on the number given by them or a pre-entered number. Under this is a static IP address that can be configured so that the user will always get the same IP address when they connect. Under this, static routes can also be defined. These options only apply to dial-up, and in a lot of cases these can also be configured in routing in remote access services or in Network Policy Server. On modem networks, you probably won't need to configure anything on this tab except making sure that it is set to control access through NPS Network Policy. The next tab is the Environment tab. These settings are used when connecting to remote desktop services or terminal services. The first setting allows a program to run automatically when the user first logs in. For example, an often used application that runs on login is one that will show the available applications on that server. At the bottom, the devices that are available to the client can be configured. The option allows drivers and printers to be connected when the user connects. The last option changes the default printer used in the session to the client's local printer. The next tab, Session, allows you to configure some options for the session created by remote desktop server or the terminal server. At the top, the time taken for a disconnected session to be ended can be configured. If a user, for example, is disconnected from a server due to a network problem, when they connect back up, they will want to connect back to their previous session without losing any data and carrying on from where they left off. You may want to consider setting a time limit so that if the user decides not to reconnect, the session does not stay running using resources on the server. It should be pointed out that these settings can also be configured on the server, so a lot of the time it may not be necessary to configure these settings in the user properties. It takes a lot of time to configure users by changing their user settings, so a lot of the time it is worth the time to look at other faster methods. The next setting down, Active Session Limit, allows the user to configure how long a session can be running. This stops a user staying connected to the server indefinitely. The setting below this allows an idle limit to be configured. This defines how long the user can be connected to the server without doing anything. Below this, you have the setting that determines what will happen when one of the two session limits above are reached. By default, the user will be disconnected, and they can then reconnect and carry on from where they left off. The option below this allows the session to be ended. The option below this allows the reconnection options to be configured. When a session is reconnected, you can configure it so the user has to reconnect from the same computer they originally connected with, or they can reconnect from any computer that they want. The next tab, Remote Control, refers to the remote control options for remote desktop sessions. If you want to disable the remote control ability for the administrator, you can disable it here. Under this, you can also set whether the user needs to give permissions for an administrator to view their session. Some companies will have policies which state that you need to ask for permission before viewing someone's session. It is, however, always considered polite to ask the user before connecting to their session. Some users may get upset if they discover you have been connecting to their session without permissions. Under this setting, you can configure if remote control will give full control or view-only access to the session. That's it for the basic settings. If I exit out of here and then right-click on the user, you can see a number of different options, making it easy to configure common administration tasks. These include Add to a Group, Disable Account, and Reset Password. There are a lot of common administrator tasks that an administrator would perform on a daily basis. Once you have one user configured the way you want, this can be used as a template. If I wanted to use these settings again for another user, I could select the Copy option. This will start the new user wizard where I can enter the basic details for the user. The difference is where possible, the properties will be copied from the other user. Once the wizard is complete, the user will be created. I have already gone through quite a few options, but there are still some options that remain that are hidden. To show these, select View and then select the option Advanced Features. Once selected, notice that additional items have appeared, like Lost and Found. If I once again open the properties for a user, there are 3 tabs available that were not available before. The first tab is Published Certificates. This will show any certificates that are associated with that user. It should be pointed out that other certificates associated with the user, for example, a local encryption EFS certificate, will not be listed here. The next tab that appears is the Password Replication tab. If you are using any read-only domain controllers, the password for this user can be cached on the read-only domain controller. Later in the course, I will cover read-only domain controllers in more detail. The last tab is the Attribute Editor. This allows the administrator to view the attributes for the user and even change them. It is recommended to use the tools provided by Microsoft to change these attributes where possible. If you change the attributes manually, it is easy to make mistakes. There are a lot of settings that are common between users. If I cancel out of here and select multiple users and open the properties for them, the settings that are common to those users will be shown. For example, I could select the Profile tab and change the profile for all the users in one go. This is useful to know if the profiles were moved from one server to another and you need to configure a lot of users at once. If you want to delete a user, you simply need to right-click the user and select Delete. One point that I would like to make: it is just as easy to disable the user. Just right-click the user and Disable Account. If a user needs to be deleted, I would recommend disabling the user account first, and later on, if there are no problems, delete the user. It is possible to recover a deleted user, however, recovering a deleted user is not an easy process. For this reason, I would recommend always disabling the user, allowing some time to pass before deleting the user. That's it for user accounts. In the next video, I will look at computer accounts. Each time you add a computer to the domain, it requires a computer account to operate. Thanks for watching another free video for IT Free Training.